When the silence ended, when magic returned to the world and the dust of the fallen enclaves began to settle over the shattered landscape of northern Faerun, the survivors looked up at an empty sky and tried to understand what had happened to them. Mystra was dead, but divinity, like nature, abhors a vacuum. Almost immediately after the goddess sacrificed herself, her divine essence reformed, coalescing into a new being who bore the same portfolio, but a different name and a profoundly different temperament. The new goddess of magic called herself Mystra, and the first thing she did upon assuming her divine mantle was to ensure that nothing like Karsus's folly could ever happen again. Mystra's ban, as it came to be known, was the most comprehensive restructuring of the rules of arcane magic in the history of Toril. It was not a negotiation. It was not a suggestion. It was a divine decree imposed unilaterally upon every spellcaster on the face of the world, and its effects were immediate, permanent, and far-reaching. First and most devastatingly, Mystra banned all magic above the 9th level. The 10th, 11th, and 12th level spells that the Netheril Arcanus had wielded, the workings of godlike power that had created mythalars and flying cities and torn the weave itself, were sealed away forever. The knowledge of how to cast them still existed, buried in the ruins of the fallen enclaves, preserved in the memories of the few surviving arcanists, but the weave itself would no longer support them. A spellcaster could know the theory. They could understand the principles. They could possess every material component and speak every word of the incantation with perfect precision, and nothing would happen. The weave would simply refuse to respond. The door to epic magic had been closed, locked, and the key thrown into the void. This single prohibition transformed the entire landscape of magical practice on Toril. The Netheril system of magic, which had recognized 12 levels of increasing power and complexity, was replaced by a system that capped at 9. The most powerful spells available to mortal spellcasters were now orders of magnitude less potent than what the Netheril had routinely wielded. The gap between mortal magic and divine magic, which the Netheril had been steadily closing for centuries, was torn open again, wider than it had ever been. Second, Mystra imposed a new system of spell preparation that drastically limited the number of spells a caster could have ready at any given time. Under the old Netheril system, arcanists had been able to hold vast libraries of spells in their minds simultaneously, drawing upon whatever they needed in the moment. Under Mystra's new rules, spellcasters were required to spend time each morning preparing a specific, limited selection of spells, and once prepared, those spells could each be cast only once before needing to be prepared again. This was, for the surviving Netheril arcanists, a humiliating regression. Like being told that a master painter could henceforth use only 3 colors and only on canvases no larger than a handkerchief. Third, and perhaps most painfully for the common people of Netheril, Mystra restricted access to magic itself. Under the old system, every citizen of Netheril had been taught the basics of spellcasting. Cantrips were universal. Magic was a birthright. Under Mystra's new dispensation, the ability to cast spells was limited to those with a specific innate aptitude, a natural talent that could not be learned or trained, but only discovered. The cantrips that had once been common knowledge, the small magics that had helped Netheril maids clean floors and Netheril farmers tend their crops, were stripped from the common population. Magic became, for the first time in Netheril history, the exclusive province of the gifted few. The symbolism was unmistakable. The goddess of magic was telling humanity, in the clearest possible terms, that the egalitarian magical culture of Netheril, the culture that had given cantrips to serving maids and fire spells to fishermen, had been a mistake. That magic in the hands of the many was too dangerous. That the power of the art must be concentrated in a smaller number of individuals who could be more easily watched, more easily regulated, more easily controlled. Whether this was wisdom or punishment is a question that sages have debated for millennia. The answer, perhaps, is that it was both. But Mystra was not only a punisher, she was also a savior. In the chaos of the fall, as the flying enclaves plummeted from the sky and the magical infrastructure of the empire collapsed, Mystra intervened to save what she could. 3 enclaves were gently lowered to the surface of Toril. Not crashed, not shattered, but set down carefully. Their inhabitants spared the apocalyptic fate that had claimed every other flying city. These three enclaves were Honoria, Asram, and Hlandath, and their survival was an act of mercy that gave the Netherese people a chance to continue. Diminished, humbled, but alive. The survivors of these three enclaves established successor kingdoms in the lands where they had been set down. Honoria, located in the region south of the fallen Heartland, became renowned for the creation of fine swords and for carrying on the magical legacy of Netheril as best it could. But without high-level magics and mythalors, their efforts were a pale shadow of what had come before, and the kingdom was eventually destroyed in a costly battle against an orc horde in 450 of the Dala Reckoning. Asram had an even shorter and more tragic existence. No sooner had the kingdom recovered from the fall than it was struck by a devastating plague sent by Talona, the goddess of disease and poison. The plague claimed every Asraman citizen in -33 of the Dala Reckoning, less than 3 centuries after the kingdom's founding. An entire people, wiped out by divine pestilence. Whether Talona acted out of malice, opportunism, or some darker motivation has never been determined. Hlandath survived longer than either of its sister kingdoms, but its history was marked by bitterness and conflict. The Hlandathans blamed the elves for their misfortunes. The elves who had given the Netherese magic in the first place. The elves who had stolen the Nether Scrolls. The elves who had watched from their forest halls as the Empire burned. In 199 of the Dala Reckoning, the Hlandathans provoked a war with the Cormanther elves, a conflict known as the Crown against Scepter Wars, and were repeatedly crushed by the forces of Myth Draenor. The kingdom was greatly weakened, and as the Anarok Desert continued its slow, inexorable expansion, the surviving Hlandathans were scattered across Faerun. Beyond the three saved enclaves, other survivors made their way to new homes by various means. A group of Netherese refugees led by a figure known as Raumark traveled south in their airships, vessels that, unlike the enclaves themselves, were powered by true magical enchantments rather than mythalars, and had therefore survived the fall. These refugees journeyed all the way to the shining south, where they founded the nation of Halruaa, a magical kingdom that would carry the flame of Netherese magical tradition for centuries, becoming one of the most magically advanced nations on Toril and a direct heir to the legacy of the Empire of Magic. Other survivors were guided to safety by the dwarves of Delzun, those old trading partners whose underground roads had connected the dwarven halls to the Netherese settlements for generations. The dwarves opened the Low Road, a subterranean passageway that led from the devastated surface to the safety of Delzun's deep halls, and guided thousands of Netherese refugees through the darkness to shelter. It was an act of extraordinary generosity and courage, and it cemented the bond between the two peoples in ways that no trade agreement ever could. But the majority of the Netherese survivors had no saved enclave to shelter in, no airship to carry them south, no dwarven friends to lead them underground. They were the common people of Low Netheril, the farmers and fishermen and laborers who had always lived on the ground in the shadow of the flying cities. For them, the fall was not a theoretical catastrophe, but a literal one. Mountains of stone fell from the sky onto the lands they had inhabited for generations. The ruins of the enclaves crushed villages, dammed rivers, and transformed the landscape into a wasteland of broken rock and residual magic. Those who survived the impacts fled in every direction, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the traumatized memories of the day the sky fell. They scattered across Faerun. They filtered into other nations, other cultures, other peoples. They brought with them fragments of Netherese knowledge, partial spells, half-remembered enchantments, stories of the flying cities that grew more fantastic with each retelling. They intermarried with local populations. They adapted to new customs. They forgot, gradually but inevitably, what it had been like to live in a world where magic was limitless and the sky was full of cities, and behind them the desert grew. The Anorok, the great waste that the Faerun's draining magic had begun to create centuries before the fall, continued to expand in the absence of the Netherese magical infrastructure that had partially counteracted its effects. The narrow sea, That great body of water that had sustained the earliest Netherese settlements dried up completely. The forests and meadows and fertile river valleys that had surrounded it were swallowed by sand. The heartland of the Empire of Magic became, over the course of a few centuries, one of the most desolate and inhospitable wastelands on the face of Toril, a vast burning desert that covered the ruins of everything the Netherese had built and everything they had been. The ruins of the fallen enclaves, scattered across the desert and the surrounding lands, became the stuff of legend. Adventurers would seek them out for centuries, braving the heat and the sandstorms and the monsters that inhabited the wasteland, in search of the magical artifacts that lay buried within, and they would find them. Eun stones, enchanted weapons, wondrous items of extraordinary power, preserved by residual magic in the wreckage of the floating cities. Each one a fragment of a lost world, each one a reminder of what had been and what had been lost, and what the price of hubris looked like when it was paid in full. The age of Netheril was over. The sky was empty. The desert was growing, and the world, diminished and chastened and forever changed, moved on. But the story of Netheril was not quite finished. Not yet. Because somewhere, in a realm of perpetual shadow, a single flying city still floated. A city that had escaped the fall by the narrowest of margins. A city whose inhabitants had not died, but had been transformed, changed by centuries of darkness into something that was no longer quite human. The city of Shade was waiting, and in 1700 years it would return.